If you're a Power AWS user, you've probably got multiple accounts with which you've got to log into the AWS command line interface tool. If that's the case, what you need to do is you need to set up multiple profiles in the tool. And I'm telling you, it's super easy to do, barely an inconvenience. I've just finished a tutorial on how to install the AWS command line interface tool. And of course, as part of that tutorial, we configured the basic default user. So when I come into my tool, I can do an AWS IAM list users command. You can see that everything works. And I've got two users, Cameron and Tomcat. I'd like to set up a dev profile for Cameron and a prod profile for Tomcat. Now, by the way, that is a different profile for a different stage. You may have one for different companies. You may work for Informa in the morning. You may work for TechTarget in the afternoon. Maybe each of those companies gives you their own set of credentials. You might want to configure a profile for each of those. So how do you do it? As I said, super easy, barely an inconvenience. I want to set up my dev profile. So I just say AWS configure -- profile dev. And now it's just going to ask me all of the standard stuff. What is the access key? What's the secret key? What is the default region that you're in? I'm in US East 1. What format do you want? Of course you want JSON. Now that's my dev user. I mentioned that I want this Tomcat user to be the prod CLI user. So I'm going to go into that Tomcat user. I'm going to click that create access key link because an access key isn't created. It's going to be for the CLI. So I'll click that beautiful orange next button after clicking the checkbox, and I'll put a little description, and then finally I get my keys. And so now I can copy that access key when I say AWS configure -- profile prod, and it says what's the access key. I paste it in. And when it asks for the secret key, I paste that in. And then finally, when it asks for the region and the output format, I say US East 1 and JSON. It's just that easy. And now, if I want to run a command as dev, I say AWS -- profile dev STS get caller identity. And who is making this call? Well, of course, it's the dev profile, and that is going to be Cameron. Let's switch it around. AWS -- profile prod STS get caller identity. Boom, all of a sudden the user is now Tomcat. So I'm switching from user to user simply by first setting up the profile and then specifying which profile to use. Now you may actually get tired of constantly putting a -- profile in. One of the cool things you can do is you can actually configure an environment variable that specifies which user to do. I'm just going to list all of my profiles here. You can see I've got the default, which is the one that was set up when I installed the tool, and dev and prod here. And you can see that when I run a command, I say get caller identity. Right now, I think I'm running as, maybe the default user, but dev and default are actually pointing to the same user. But let's say I wanted to switch to prod, and prod is Tomcat. What I can do is I can say, hey, let's set this environment variable, AWS default profile, set it to prod, and then say AWS STS get caller identity. And notice, in this case, I didn't say -- profile. However, just running that basic command while the AWS default profile is prod, you'll notice that I'm now using that prod account, which is Tomcat. So that's something that's going to speed you up as well when you do configure multiple profiles, and you got to stick with one profile for a long time. Now, the other thing that's worth taking a look at is just where this profile information is stored, because you can edit it by hand. Go into your user profile. This could be Ubuntu, this could be Windows. I'm the owner user, and you'll see the .aws folder dig in there, and you'll see the config and credentials. When you get into config, you'll see that it indicates that there's a couple of users there. You can see the default dev and prod profiles, and you can see the region that's preferred along with the output type. And of course, there's that credentials link there as well. You might want to keep this one under a tight lock and key. And you can see here that now we've actually listed here in this file the default, the dev, and the prod access keys and secret keys for those users as well. And if you need to change things up, you can just go in these files and edit them by hand. You don't have to use AWS Configure. And there you go. That's how easy it is to set up multiple profiles in the AWS command line interface tools by using AWS Config Profiles.